Okay, this phylum is called Ascomycota. Now remember, anything that ends in mycota is fungus. So they're all going to end in that mycota. This is our sac fungi. Most of them are multicellular, but we do have some unicellular species in this phylum. Typically the yeast, that's the most common in this phyla. Their habitats, they're saprophytic, so they are decomposers of dead and decaying material. They can be parasitic or they can be mutualistic. Certainly, yeast in our gut, we have a mutualistic relationship with it until it overgrows, so they can be either. They're either reproducing sexually or asexual. Now, asexual reproduction occurs in favorable conditions. They do have a very complicated life cycle, which I'm going to try to simplify for you. But asexual reproduction is going to be different because if they're reproducing asexually, then they're going to produce spores that are just going to be dispersed. They're going to land in a favorable environment and grow into a new hyphae. The sexual, they're going to be contained until conditions can become favorable. This phylum has got more species in it than any of the other phylum, and like I said, this is the phylum that contains our yeast. Now, let's go through the types of reproduction. Asexual reproduction is when times are favorable. So they form hyphae, remember they're the long filaments, called conidiophores. The spores are going to be called conidia. The conidiospores form externally on the tip of the conidiophore. Now, the conidiophore, guys, is like the sporangiophore that we talked about in zygomycota. But with this one, the ending "-phore" just means it's a type of hyphae that forms the spore. So don't let that confuse you, because I told you every time it changes phylum, it's going to change its name. So the reproductive structure itself that forms the spores are called conidiophores. The spores are going to be called conidia, and they form on the outside of the very tip of the conidiophore. Then what's going to happen is wind is going to come along, or water, or animals, and that's the way that the spores are going to be dispersed. They're going to land in favorable conditions, which for a fungus is going to be warm and moist, and they're going to form a new yeast. Sexual reproduction, now yeast, they have a little bit different. Let me just explain them. Yeast are going to asexually reproduce through budding, and that means it's just going to form a little bud like off of a stem. The bud is going to fall to the ground, and we're going to have a new yeast. So that is a little bit different in that budding is their type of asexual reproduction. Now, the other ones reproduce sexually in times when the conditions are not favorable. So what happens here is two hyphae from opposite mating types, and there is a picture on the next slide. There's going to be a positive and a negative. They join to form this reproductive structure called an ascocarp. The ascocarp is rather large, and inside, carp kind of means like bucket, and you'll see what I'm talking about when you see the picture. But inside of the ascocarp is a sac, and the sac is called an ascus. And the ascus is actually where the spores are formed, and the spores are going to be called ascospores. So the reproductive structure sexually is an ascocarp. It's called an ascus. Within the ascocarp, that's the sac, and then ascospores are the spores. Now, the spores are haploid, which means they have half of the genetic information. Now, this is an unfavorable time, so what they're going to do is they're going to remain inside of this sac until conditions are favorable. And then the ascus inside the ascocarp is going to break open, and they're going to release the spores, and the spores are going to be dispersed by wind. So let me show you a picture of where this is happening. Look down here to the left. So here we have our haploid hyphae. This is where we're going to start. And that is going to grow into a hyphae called a conidiophore. Now that's this structure. And these little spores, these conidia, they form on the outside of these conidiophores. And that's really special to this particular phylum because most spores don't form that way. And they're going to form on the outside, and then what's going to happen is the wind's going to blow them, and then we're going to have a new hyphae. Now, if it is reproducing sexually, that's not what happens. It's going to form these hyphae, these opposite mating types. The mating type here is negative, and this one should be positive, and they're going to join, and they're going to form this entire body. This whole big large thing is called the ascocarp. It's the fruiting body. It's going to be what you see above ground. Then on the inside, this little round spot is being blown up. This is the ascus. And the ascus is producing what are called ascospores that are these little red and blue, what you see here in the middle. And then the ascospores are going to stay in this ascus until favorable conditions. When the conditions are favorable and they're released, we're going to have the two opposite mating types join, and through meiosis, they're going to form a new ascomycota. So the reproductive cycles are just a little bit different. It's conidia and conidiophores if it's asexual, and through sexual reproduction, it's going to form this large ascocarp. Inside is a sac called the ascus. The ascus holds spores called ascospores. And then when favorable conditions occur, they're released and they will join, and this cycle can reproduce over and over. But remember, during favorable conditions, they're just going to form these conidiophores. The conidia are going to form on the outside, and they are going to be blown or travel with animals or water and form a new sac fungi.